have worked on my modest plantation in the West Indies, and it will work throughout the South. Take this simple little list on differences, think about them. On the top of my list is age, but it's only there because it starts with an A. The second is color or shade. There is intelligence, size, sex, size of plantation, status on plantation, attitude of owner, whether the slaves live in the valley, on a hill, east, west, north, south. Whether they have fine or coarse hair, or is tall or short. Now that you have a list of differences, I shall give you an outline of action. Before that, I shall assure you that distrust is stronger than trust, and envy is stronger than adulation, respect, or admiration. The black slave, after receiving this indoctrination, shall carry on and will become self-refueling and self-generating for hundreds of years, maybe thousands. Don't forget, you must pitch the old black versus the young black male, and the young black male against the old black male. You must use the dark-skinned slaves versus the light-skinned slaves, and the light-skinned slaves versus the dark-skinned slaves. You must also have our white servants and overseers distrust all blacks, but it is necessary that your slaves trust and depend on us. They must love, respect, and trust only us. Gentlemen, these kits are your keys to control. Use them. Have your wives and children use them. Never miss an opportunity. My plan is guaranteed, and the good thing about this plan is that if used intensely for 1 year, the slaves themselves will remain perpetually distrustful. Thank you, gentlemen. Okay, so there are some that will say the Massa Lynch's letter is apocryphal, i.e. fictional. If it isn't real, it's as if it were implemented. Pretty much. Okay, so where are we? Okay, his strategy is basic: divide and conquer. So no wonder he uses the Romans, among others. I mean, that tactic was older than the Romans anyway, but it is the basis of a lot of intra-group, intra meaning within a group, as well as extra group, outside of the group, prejudice and discrimination. Let me quickly find my place here. Match? Yes, right. Okay, I told you this already. So, Captain John Lynch. All right, so Free Negroes, 1723. This is after the Willie Lynch letter. Free Negroes lose the right to vote, bear arms, or bear witness in court. So notice, oh, well, they're not indentured servants. They are free. So they lose the right to vote. Thomas Jefferson drafts a law in Virginia which, if enacted, would have put black freedmen and freed women or a white woman who bore a mulatto child outside of the law if they remained in the Commonwealth of Virginia long more than a year. So notice what's happening here. So an indentured servant can be freed out of X amount of time if they're an indentured servant. But there are also free blacks living in Virginia at the time too. Now, if You give them if you lose the right to vote, bear arms, or bear witness in court, you can be enslaved or arrested if you remain in the state. Put in slavery, right? That's the only reason you would do that. Because if the right to vote is basically predicated on you pay a poll tax to be able to vote, and you have money, you have land, why wouldn't you have arms if you had land? Because you need to hunt, etc., and defend yourself, right? So if you make all that illegal, then you can do all manner of things. So black freedmen and freedwomen, or a white woman who bore a mulatto child outside of the law if they remained in the Commonwealth more than years. Or outside of the law means you can be killed by anyone with no legal consequences. It's not a crime. Okay, so there's no reason for you to stay here. And if you do stay here, well, you can be killed. And your descendants can't do anything about it. So, similar in its effects as the Willie Lynch letter would have been on blacks, a century later, in 1825, white laborers refused to work alongside free black laborers. So Jefferson was clearly of a lot of different minds with regard to race, slavery, and the rights of man. He penned an anti-slavery section of the Declaration of Independence where he rails against George III for supporting slavery. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating his most sacred right of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation hither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. Now, of course, he had slaves himself. This is what my grandma would call the pot calling the kettle black. He had slaves, as did many others, and so that particular section was taken out of the Declaration of Independence. And there's 9 interlocking articles of the Constitution which protect chattel slavery. So these are Article 1, Section 2. Representatives in the House were apportioned among the states on the basis of population computed by counting all free persons and 3/5 of the slaves. That is the federal number. 3/5 clause, i.e. blacks were basically counted for the purpose of apportioning representatives. So here's the deal. You get members of Congress based on population. If you're a slave owner, we're not going to count all the slaves that you own. The slaves aren't going to be represented anyway. We will count 60% of that number. So slaves aren't to be counted as full human beings. So a person is defined in the sense that we the people means essentially rich white men. And so of course didn't mean white women, Indian nations, free blacks, or other people of color. Article 1, Section 2, and Article 1, Section 9, 2 different clauses requiring redundantly that direct taxes, including capitations, capitation means per head, for the apportion among the states on the foregoing basis, the purpose being to prevent Congress from laying a head tax on slaves to encourage their emancipation. Article 1, Section 9, Congress was prohibited from abolishing the international slave trade in the United States before 1808. Article 4, Section 2, the states were prohibited from emancipating fugitive slaves who were to be returned on demand of the master. Congress, Article 1, Section 8, Congress is empowered to provide for calling up the states' militias to suppress insurrections, including slaves uprisings. So obviously, again, from an original position, you don't create a law in your Constitution unless this is happening, and it's happening constantly. Anybody ever been to Virginia, Old Town? There's a reason why a lot of those buildings are built with bricks. Bricks are hard to burn. And slaves were constantly rebelling. So burning wooden structures wouldn't make sense. It's harder to set fire to a brick structure, so lots of bricks in Virginia because of those slave uprisings. The federal government was obliged to protect the states against domestic violence, including slave insurrections. The provision of Article 1, Section 9, Clauses 1 and 4 pertaining to slave trade and direct taxes were made unamendable. These two clauses prohibited the federal government and the states from taxing exports, and purpose being to prevent them from taxing slavery indirectly by taxing the exported product of slave labor. And this is from the late constitutional scholar Derek Bell in his book, And We Are Not Saved. So American-style capitalism. Adam Smith, who wrote in his book, The Wealth of Nations. Now, Adam Smith, in, what was it? I believe the 1600s, I think, or 1700s. In any case, he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, where he's a Methodist minister, so he writes about the moral responsibility of the wealthy to maintain the social contract and the social fabric. Now, when you hear people talk about in public discourse about the social contract, this is where that's coming from. He's saying profit is good in capitalism because profit is God's gift to you to enable you to give to the less fortunate. In fact, it's your Christian duty to give to the less fortunate. So he's saying that the wealthy have to maintain that social contract, and that social contract is to, like Christ did, take care of the less fortunate than you and treat them as if they're connected to you. So profit is good, but the greater good is to use your wealth for the benefit of your community. Okay? Similar to belief that wealth was a gift from God to help you do God's work of reducing misery and suffering. So in America, these moral values were written out of conceptions of capitalism. That is, profit is good and more profit is better, even if it comes at the expense of the social fabric. So the original model written by Adam Smith in England got changed. And I don't know if you need an economics class to read The Wealth of Nations. It's a lengthy tome, but there's some interesting stuff in it. So what happened in what I refer to, my Marxist friends will say there is no such thing as moral capitalism. Well, I'm saying, look, Adam Smith is basically setting out the moral tone for capitalism. Doesn't mean that so if people don't follow it, people don't follow it, but at least he said it. So what I call amoral capitalism is not Adam Smith's model. It goes like this. In chattel slavery, you could buy a human female, rape her, and then sell her children, that is your offspring, at will, at a profit, and not feel anything about it. And it was legal. So if you take that basic mean, okay, that's against the morals of Adam Smith, which this is destroying the social fabric. Selling your kids is not okay. Rape is not okay. So you have to give up your morals to actually be a practicing slaver, which is, there are some people, some Christians, like Quakers, are saying slavery is immoral. It doesn't matter if we're breaking the law, we're obeying a higher law. That's the Quakers. The Mormons had a different point of view, because there were black people among Joseph Smith in the time that this is going on. Mormons believe in obeying the law. And okay, you're a runaway slave. Well, you're breaking the law even though you're a runaway slave. So we're not going to help hide you. Okay, so only free blacks could be Mormons with Joseph Smith. And there were free blacks killed with Joseph Smith. And then Mormonism became something else. Different. So, in America and other eras of European culture, racism was wedded to capitalism with the tenets of Romanized Christianity. So we discover the non-Christian world, and it is our property because God said so. If we baptize them first, it's okay to kill non-white children or sell them into slavery. And so I'm not just referring to Aztecs here. I'm referring to the Irish and Scots. Okay, so when I'm saying that white people were sold into slavery by white people, the Irish and Scots were technically not considered Christian under these same rules. Okay, and they were attacked by the English and enslaved and sent to the British colonies, which included America and West Indies, where they were also working under Willie Lynch. So we have actually a lot of, this wasn't just the Spanish conquistadors with Aztecs blessing Aztec children and then killing them by the sword. Oh, we baptized you first, so you're going instantly to heaven and we'll give you a free ride there. It's not just happening with Aztec non-white kids. It's also happening with the Irish and Scots, too. The Highland Clearances is not a clothing sale. It's ethnic cleansing. Okay? The English did to the Irish and Scots what they later did to Native Americans, and the Americans did to Native Americans. First. Okay? This is written about in the Irish Book of Conquest, which you can read sections of it online. They talk about this. They basically, in the Book of Conquest, they not only talk about this, they also talk about the last Egyptian, the daughter of the last Egyptian pharaoh, whose name was Scotia, who came and conquered England and Ireland and Scotland. That's why it's called Scotland, because Scotia. And her son, Gael, which is why we speak Gaelic. Kind of blew my mind, too. I said, really? Yes, it's all there in the Book of Conquest. Okay. So, God said it's okay to do genocide and slavery. Or we said God said it's okay. Whoever we is. So, today I'm just talking about these Maroon leaders. This is a conference in front of the White House in about the 80s. And the reason I'm bringing up Maroons is because we're talking about American-style capitalism and slavery, but I'm just pointing out that the other side of the narrative with slavery is that there are people that are always escaping slavery, and they start communities, and these are descendants of those folks. 3 different Maroons. The Njuka Maroons from Suriname in northern South America, the Seminole, who are basically black Indians living in Florida, and the Jamaican Maroons. And they're at a conference in D.C. We've already referred to the Njuka Maroon life cycle. This is Moore Town in Jamaica, a Maroon stronghold. So, Africans, of course, were no stranger to firearms, so I'm basically talking about responses to slavery. So we've been trading with the Chinese long before Marco Polo, and some of us had firearms 50 years before Europeans, so we weren't strangers to diplomacy or warfare with Europeans either, and no strangers to exploration. So Maroonage was one response to slavery. It had a particular power because in the case of Palmares, which is a Maroon republic in Brazil, and other quilombos, which is their name for Maroon cities, you can defend a land base. And basically, the definition of a republic is the ability to defend a land base against military powers and maintain it for a number of years. Palmares was one of the largest quilombos. So you could also escape into Indian country in Mexico, the whaling industry, shipping industry, and or pirates. So 3 conditions in slavery in order of power: master, slave, and maroon. So maroon doesn't mean to abandon. It is a Taino word which means wild and free. So 3 conditions in slavery: master, slave, and maroon. So as an example, this is a representation, not the real guy, but a representation, a reenactment. So one response to slavery was piracy. So despite, Disney representations of the Pirates of the Caribbean, which is always ironic to me when having grown up in Disneyland and, seeing the Pirates of the Caribbean, and all the pirates in the ride are white. But in the movie, they portray multiracial crews, which is actually the historical reality. So, according to the historical record, there were no all-white pirate crews. Ever. Disney notwithstanding. One African pirate captain, Lawrence de Graaf, he was a Dutch citizen, was captured and enslaved by the Spanish off the coast of Africa, and managed to capture and take over most of the fleet that had enslaved him by the time they got to Cuba. Arguably the most talented and feared corsair, that's a synonym for pirate. For nearly a quarter of a century, his name, whether pronounced Lawrence Seal or simply Lawrence, was whispered with awe and dread whenever a strange sail approached, and was included in the prayers and petitions of many a Spanish coastal town in Mexico and elsewhere. See, here's what the deal. He's a Dutch citizen. He gets captured by Spanish slavers. They sail off to Cuba. But before they get to Cuba, he takes over the ships. And thereafter, basically, he has a, sorry to be this graphic, he has a hard-on for Spanish shipping, particularly slavers. He hunts them because there's a massive slave trade going on through Cuba. So he attacks them, and basically the deal he offers the slaves is, well, he kills the crew and then offers the slaves this deal: you can join us or die with the crew. Which will it be? Right? So then he's increasing his ships, his fleet. So he only preyed on Spanish shipping and also Spanish coastal towns in Mexico and all throughout the Caribbean. So far more successful in terms of wealth than Kidd or Blackbeard, Lawrence is nonetheless far less famous than either. He, an ex-slave, was also knighted by the French as Major Lawrence Corneille Baldrin Sieur de Graaf, Lieutenant Duras, Lieutenant of the King in the Isles of Saint Domingo, which is, Santo Domingo, Haiti, Captain de Frigate Légère, Chevalier de Saint-Louis. He never lost a battle at sea, even when hopelessly outnumbered, and was only defeated once on land in 1695 when an Anglo-Hispanic force of 3,200 invaded Haiti. He was not captured, but his wife and children were in that particular battle. He was shipped to France, accused of treason in the defeat. Well, the French essentially couldn't have won in any case because they were outnumbered, but they needed a scapegoat, and he happened to be the scapegoat. His success as a pirate financially was unmatched by any historical pirate not of his race. though of course the white ones made ink. You've heard of Captain Kidd and Blackbeard, etc., but never usually Lawrence de Graaf. He particularly targeted Spanish shipping, and after his court-martial in France, he was allowed to retire in what was French territory, what is now Biloxi, Mississippi. That being later what we call the Louisiana Purchase. So here's a graphic of a pirate ship, multiracial crew, and the symbolism behind the pirate flag. Death and rebirth on the account. So this is called the Jolly Roger. Jolly in Old English meant brave, as in for he's a jolly good fellow, or the Jolly Roger. So the idea behind the Jolly Roger is that the symbolism basically represents death and rebirth. If you're an escaped slave, so it's death because pirates saw themselves as being dead to oppressive colonial and European societies, which is pretty much the only game in town. So if you left those societies, you are essentially dead to those societies, and at the same time, many of the times those societies had you under a death sentence for being a pirate anyway. So they also knew it was certain death to be captured, other than the ones who occasionally hired them to attack enemy shipping, which frequently happened as well. So the crossed thigh bones represented rebirth and standing free on your own 2 feet, and the skull, of course, is death. Now, pirate ships were floating democracies in the sense that every member of the crew had voting rights while on the account. And that's what they called the account. The account, every crew member had an equal share of all captured goods. The crew could override the captain's decision by vote, majority rule, no historical record of an all-white pirate crew, and all European powers on the ocean were racially mixed societies. So people of color were often not rich, had few options, so it's either be a pirate, join the whaling fleets, etc. So the crew could override the captain's decision, but the captain owned the ship and decided where the ship was going to go. So if you think about this as a social protest, arr, the revolutionary formula of the French liberty, equality, and fraternity is expanded to include the concept of transnationalism. Pirates still fit this model paradigm insofar as they were less divided by national, religious, or racial differences than Europeans caught in that whole web of institutionalized, dynastic, so basically family-owned royalty and national, religious, and racial hatreds. Multiculturalism sprang not from idealistic sentiment, but pragmatic spirit of revolt against common enemies. So while disempowered groups are typically disunited and at odds with each other, going on the account was an empowering act which could lead to the partial dissolution of social differences. Ken Kinkor is a researcher who is associated with the Whydah, which is a intact pirate ship found off the coast of Massachusetts. So prior to the French Revolution, rejection of monarchical authority meant rejection of national allegiance. In a speech attributed to Samuel de Bellamy, but probably actually delivered by another pirate, Paul Grave Williams, a pirate captain claimed leadership as legitimate as that of any king. I am a free prince, and I have as much authority to make war on the whole world as he who has 100 sail of ships at sea and an army of 100,000 men in the field. And this my conscience tells me. Captain Dirk Shivers and his compatriots, acknowledging no countrymen, said they had sold their country and were sure to be hanged if taken, and they would take no quarter, but would do all the mischief they could. So the only nation that many pirates would claim was the deck below their feet, and if asked whence they hailed, the likely reply was from the seas. So as late as 1785, a mulatto and 3 white shipmates seized the schooner, vowing to perform a true truce in defense of ourselves and against all other